Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. This is what's been going on in Iran and the Middle East in the past 24 hours. The U.S. Iran interim framework is already under strain, and the pressure point is Lebanon. Talks that were expected to move into the next technical phase in Switzerland have been delayed after a rapid escalation between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah killed 4 Israeli soldiers in southern Lebanon, and Israel responded with strikes across multiple areas in Lebanon, resulting in significant casualties. That exchange didn't just escalate a local fight, it directly disrupted the diplomatic calendar tied to the broader U.S.-Iran agreement. What matters here is timing. This was supposed to be the implementation phase, where political language starts turning into technical mechanisms. Instead, the system is reacting to events that sit outside the negotiating room entirely. And that's becoming the defining feature of this moment. Because the agreement itself is built on a very ambitious assumption that you can stabilize a U.S.-Iran conflict while leaving Israel-Hezbollah dynamics to settle themselves. Right now, that assumption is getting tested in real time. Iran is actively trying to expand the leverage structure of the deal. Messaging tied to IRGC-linked outlets is connecting progress on the agreement to what happens in Lebanon. In practical terms, the argument being advanced is that Israel's operations against Hezbollah should be treated as part of the same political equation as sanctions relief and maritime access. That brings us to the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping through Hormuz has restarted, but it is not back to anything resembling normal. Tankers are moving again, including Saudi and commercial vessels, and oil is flowing back into global markets. That has helped ease immediate energy pressure and stabilized prices compared to the crisis peak. But the operational reality is still messy. Navigation risks remain elevated. There are still reported mines in key transit areas. GPS interference and route congestion are forcing ships into less optimal channels near Oman. So while the headline is reopening, the lived reality is closer to managed risk than restored normality. And that distinction is important because Iran is signaling it wants to shape the next phase of how the strait works. There is already discussion of introducing structured maritime fees after the current 60-day window tied to negotiations. That is a major shift in how Tehran views the waterway, not just as a strategic choke point, but as a revenue-generating and regulatory instrument. Regional actors, particularly Gulf states, are pushing back hard on that idea, arguing that it effectively turns an international shipping lane into a controlled toll system. So even while oil flows improve, the long-term governance question over Hormuz is completely unresolved. Now step back and look at the broader regional picture. Israel is continuing operations in southern Lebanon, focused on degrading Hezbollah infrastructure and maintaining what it describes as a security buffer zone near the border. These operations are not just tactical responses anymore. They are now directly influencing diplomatic timelines between Washington and Tehran. Hezbollah, meanwhile, is continuing intermittent attacks against Israeli positions, including drone and missile activity that has caused casualties among Israeli forces. The result is a persistent low to mid-intensity conflict that keeps pulling the region back into escalation just as diplomacy tries to move forward. And here's where the friction point gets sharper. U.S. messaging has started to reflect frustration with Israeli operational tempo in Lebanon, particularly the risk that continued strikes could undermine the broader diplomatic framework. At the same time, Israeli leadership is signaling that operational freedom in Lebanon is non-negotiable as long as Hezbollah remains active near its northern border. So you've got a triangle forming. Washington trying to preserve a diplomatic window, Israel prioritizing immediate security threats, and Iran leveraging both dynamics to expand its bargaining position. Inside Iran, the leadership is carefully managing how this moment is framed domestically. The supreme leader's position is essentially that Iran has entered negotiations from a place of strength, not concession. The agreement is being presented as something shaped by pressure on the United States rather than compromise from Tehran. That framing matters internally because Iran is also trying to absorb the post-conflict economic transition. There is an expectation of sanctions relief, access to frozen assets, and expanded oil exports. In theory, that could inject significant liquidity into the economy. In practice, how that money is distributed and how quickly it translates into domestic relief will be politically sensitive. There is also an underlying risk that once wartime unity fades, internal pressures return quickly. Inflation, unemployment, and broader economic grievances were already present before the war cycle escalated. Relief may ease pressure, but it won't erase structural issues. Now bring Iraq into this picture, because it's quietly becoming another extension of the same system. Washington is reportedly tying economic support and financial flows to reforms targeting Iranian-linked militia networks inside Iraq. That includes pressure on the Popular Mobilization Forces structure, attempts to limit smuggling and dollar diversion networks, and broader efforts to reduce militia autonomy within state institutions. The key detail here is financial. Iraq's economic system is heavily dependent on dollar liquidity tied to oil revenues. That gives the United States leverage point influence over internal Iraqi political and security decisions. And it also places Iranian-linked groups inside Iraq under increasing external financial pressure, even as Iran itself may see partial sanctions relief. So instead of one pressure point, you've got a distributed system. Iran inside the country, proxies in Lebanon, militia networks in Iraq, and maritime leverage in the Gulf. All connected, all moving at slightly different speeds. And then there's the Indo-Pacific angle, which is quieter but structurally similar. Taiwan is watching U.S. behavior closely as arms sales remain under review. President Lai is publicly confident, but the underlying concern is straightforward. U.S. commitments are increasingly being interpreted through a transactional lens, where military support can be folded into broader bargaining with China. That creates a parallel dynamic to what's happening in the Middle East. Allies are watching how flexible U.S. commitments become when great power negotiations are in play. Thank you for listening and for contributing to the growth of this community. If you found the show valuable, a review or a thoughtful comment helps extend its reach to others. For more in-depth analysis, we publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, covering Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Take care and have a great weekend.